pad.
Okay.
So we're just going to leave that that way.
Okay.
Um, the screen's here. I had it put in so nobody could see it, but clicker, you can just advance.
Okay.
If you hit the stop button, it stops it.
Okay.
If you hit it again, it comes back. We've learned. So you could just advance.
So at what point will it go live?
Whenever you tell me. It's just. There you go. You're ready to roll. And then you'll see it.
Good afternoon. I'm Erin Campbell, Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget. I'm joined today by State Economist Dr. Laura Kalbakidis and State Budget Director Anna Mingi to present the November 2023 Budget and Economic Forecast. Our twice-a-year forecasts are efforts to predict what lies ahead. We analyze many data points in developing our forecasts, and they represent the best financial projections we can provide based on the information available when we prepare them. I want to thank my colleagues at Minnesota Management and Budget, some of whom you will hear from in a few minutes, for their hard work and commitment in preparing this forecast. I also want to recognize staff from agencies throughout state government who provided the information necessary to create this forecast. Many economic and policy factors help drive forecast outlooks, and we'll talk about some of those factors today. Overall, I would characterize today's forecast outlook as mixed. For FY 24-25, we project a healthy general fund surplus of $2.4 billion, $808 million more than anticipated at the end of the most recent legislative session. Since our last forecast, the outlook for the U.S. economy in the near term has improved. This is driven by stronger than expected consumer spending, business investment, and employment. Turning to our revenue projections, we forecast increases in consumer spending and corporate profits. These increases will translate into higher tax revenues in the current biennium than what we had anticipated at session's end. However, state spending is also projected to be higher, driven largely by increased expenses related to health and human services and education, such as disability waivers, and increases in the number of pupils in Minnesota schools. In this forecast, spending is projected to outpace revenues in each fiscal year, creating a structural imbalance that depletes the bottom line. On top of the structural imbalance, you will recall that due to a statutory change, we now include the impact of inflation on the expenditure side of the equation. That adds to the gap between revenues and expenses you'll see in the coming slides. This slide shows the change in forecasted FY 24-25 budgetary balance in the middle column compared to the end of legislative session estimates in the left column. The column furthest to the right on the table shows the change between the end of session and this forecast. The bottom row of this chart shows the budgetary balance, which we are projecting in this forecast to be $2.4 billion for the current biennium. This is an increase of $808 million over the end of session estimates and is after an additional allocation of $61 million to the budget reserve. The biggest driver of this change is the $1 billion that has been added to our beginning balance for the FY 24-25 biennium. As you might have read in our first ever biennium budget close report for FY 22-23, we ended that biennium with a positive variance, which is then added to the beginning balance of the current biennium. In this forecast, revenues are also up for FY 24-25. In later slides, Dr. Kalbakidis will provide additional details about the higher consumer spending and corporate profit growth, which contributes to an increase of $837 million in revenue that we are forecasting. Expenditure estimates are also forecasted to increase $998 million in the current biennium, a majority of which are due to increased spending in health and human services and education spending, which State Budget Director Mingi will detail later in our presentation. As you can see, this offsets the increased revenue projections in this biennium. The next line shows the balance in our cash flow account, which remains unchanged in this forecast. The line below that shows the change in the budget reserve, which now totals $2.9 billion. As a reminder, under existing statute, our budget reserve levels are recalculated every November forecast so that our reserve target remains adequate to manage the underlying risks in Minnesota's revenue system. Again, the budgetary balance for this biennium is projected to be $2.4 billion. This is a projected balance that will carry over into fiscal year 26-27 biennium if it is unspent this year. Normally, when we talk about the budget, we focus on the current biennium. Based on how our budget is structured, however, we also have to be concerned about the following budget years because each biennium impacts the next. So this slide focuses on fiscal years 26 and 27. For fiscal year 24-25, the projected balance of nearly $2.4 billion is shown in the dark blue bar on the left. That amount will carry over into fiscal years 26-27 if unspent. We expect baseline expenditures in fiscal years 26 and 27 will outpace revenues by more than $1.4 billion, as you can see in the light green bar on the left. When you add that to the $880 million in inflation to maintain the same level of services going forward, you get a total projected structural imbalance of just over $2.3 billion. That leaves a projected balance of only $82 million at the end of fiscal years 26 and 27. $82 million provides little cushion when you consider the size of our projected state budget. Such a small balance, together with a structural imbalance, suggests policymakers will need to be very thoughtful when making budget decisions this next year. So with that overview, I'd like to invite Minnesota State economist, Dr. Laura Kalmbakidis, to the podium to describe our economic and revenue outlook.
Thank you, Commissioner Campbell. I'm Laura Kalmbakidis, Minnesota State economist. I'll start with the outlook for the U.S. economy. I'll move to, and how that's changed since February. I'll move to Minnesota's labor market, and then turn to details of our new revenue forecast. Since Minnesota's budget and economic forecast was last prepared in February, U.S. real GDP has grown faster than forecast, driven by faster than expected growth in real consumer spending and business investment. This, along with unexpectedly strong employment growth, prompted S&P Global Market Intelligence, Minnesota's macroeconomic consulting firm, to raise their GDP outlook for 2023. Oh, my fault. For 2023. In this first chart, we're showing the S&P forecast for annual growth in U.S. real GDP. The light bars show the February forecast, and the dark bars show the history and the current forecast. S&P now expects real GDP to grow 2.4% this year. That's 1.7 percentage points faster than what they expected in February. And that was when S&P expected a mild recession in the first half of the year. This recession didn't materialize, and the BEA now estimates that real GDP grew in the first 2 quarters of this year. Long-term interest rates have risen higher than forecast in February, causing financial conditions to become more restrictive. In addition, largely due to the stronger economy, the Federal Reserve is expected to keep rates higher over the next couple of years than S&P forecast in February. That's the higher for longer narrative you've been hearing about regarding monetary policy. Consequently, S&P has reduced their growth expectations beyond 23. For 24 through 27, average annual real GDP growth is now expected to be 0.2 percentage points less than in the February baseline. So, regarding the change in the U.S. outlook since February, an outperforming economy so far this year raises the near-term forecast, and tighter financial conditions lower the forecast in subsequent years. The next chart shows the forecast for annual growth in U.S. real GDP consumer spending. In real consumer spending, which has markedly improved. Spending has exhibited more resilience this year than expected in February, as the U.S. labor market has added jobs at a faster pace than predicted, and wage income has grown. S&P now expects real consumer spending to increase 2.3% in 23, 1.3 percentage points higher than in the February forecast. S&P expects spending to increase 1.9% in 24, 0.8 percentage points higher than in their February forecast. Similar to the forecast for real GDP, growth then decelerates in years 25 through 27, averaging 1.7% annually. This chart illustrates the forecast change for the dollar value or level of U.S. corporate profits. The dark line shows the history and the current forecast. The dashed line shows the February forecast. The level of profits is now expected to be higher throughout our forecast period compared to February. Note, however, that beginning in the third quarter of next year, S&P expects a period of corporate profit decline extending through mid-26, even while remaining above the level of the February forecast. On an annual basis, S&P expects corporate profits to grow 0.9% in 24, decline in 25 and 26, and resume growth in 27. Moving to Minnesota's labor market, this chart shows the official unemployment rate for Minnesota as the dark line and for the U.S. as the light line. The state's labor market has eased somewhat from the record low unemployment rates and record high job vacancies that we experienced in the last 2 years. But unemployment in Minnesota remains low, with a rate of 3.2%, 0.7 percentage points below the U.S. rate. At 68.5%, Minnesota's labor force participation rate is 5.8 percentage points above the U.S. rate and is the fourth highest among U.S. states. And as employers will tell you, we still have a strong demand for workers across the state, with more than 2 job openings per unemployed worker statewide. This chart shows total jobs in Minnesota starting at the end of the 07-08 recession, and I'm only showing you the top of the graph here, starting at about 2.6 million jobs. You can see the fairly steady job growth the state experienced during the 10 years of economic expansion, reaching around 2.9 million jobs, people, in February of 2020. You can see the job loss in the spring of 2020 with the start of the pandemic recession and the subsequent recovery. The state continues to add jobs, and in September, Minnesota's payroll employment surpassed its pre-pandemic level. Additional employment growth in October pushed the total number of jobs in the state to 3 million for the first time. Turning now to the revenue forecast. The first 2 columns of this table show our current forecast for the current biennium and the change from the end of session estimate. And the second 2 columns show the same thing for the next biennium. Total revenues for the current biennium are now forecast to be $837 million more than the end of session estimate. Individual income tax receipts are now expected to be $206 million more than the end of session estimate. Using current but preliminary information regarding tax year 22, which is the base year for this forecast, we have a lower starting point for the income tax forecast than we had in February. That lower starting point then carries forward to the rest of the forecast years. Technical adjustments, which on net raise the income tax forecast, more than offset that lower base year liability estimate. The sales tax is now forecast to generate $156 million more than the prior estimate. This is due to higher than expected net sales tax receipts so far in fiscal year 24 and the higher forecast for consumer spending I mentioned earlier. For the corporate tax, a higher base, also from higher receipts so far this fiscal year, and that higher expected corporate profit that I illustrated earlier, raise our revenue projection by $250 million over the prior estimate. Total revenues for the next biennium are now forecast to be $30 million less than the prior estimate. Higher forecasts for sales tax, corporate tax, and other tax revenues offset a lower forecast for the individual income tax. Note that the pattern of corporate receipts, lower in the next biennium than in the current biennium, even while we've raised both forecasts, follows that pattern of declining profits I mentioned earlier. And the income tax forecast for fiscal years 26 and 27, which we've now reduced from our prior estimate, reflects that lower base year liability and slower economic growth in the out years that I talked about earlier. Let me highlight some of the risks to the forecast. I haven't yet talked about inflation, which has moderated substantially this year. CPI inflation was 3.2% in October, 2.8 percentage points lower than February. The current baseline forecast assumes that the U.S. economy slows, as I showed in that first chart, that the U.S. unemployment rate rises and CPI inflation falls to 2.7% in 24, and an average of 2.2% per year in 25 through 27. S&P assumes the Fed will raise the federal funds rate in December, followed by a policy reversal or rate decrease in June of 24. If inflation persists above the projected level, the Fed may act more aggressively to raise rates than assumed in the baseline forecast. International events pose risks to this forecast. For example, worsening conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East could lead to higher energy prices or the reemergence of supply chain issues. And other international risks, such as economic volatility in China, could disrupt the U.S. economic path. With 19 months remaining until the end of the 24-25 biennium, even small changes in assumed rates of growth in important income sources, including capital gains and corporate profits, can generate large changes in the outlook for this biennium. But even more, the difficulty of projecting long-range economic conditions and taxpayer responses to law changes warrants particular caution when using forecasts for 26 and 27. I'll now turn it over to State Budget Director Anna Minge.
Thank you, Dr. Kolombakidis. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anna Minge, State Budget Director with Minnesota Management and Budget. I'm going to walk through changes in the general fund expenditure forecast and then turn it back to Commissioner Campbell, who will go over our long-term budget outlook. This chart lays out projected general fund spending in both the current biennium and the next by major programmatic area. It also includes a column for each biennium outlining changes from our previous estimates. So our previous estimates were those we made at the end of session. They included both the February forecast, but then added on enacted changes by the 2023 legislature. I'd like to first draw your attention to the very bottom line of the slide, total general fund spending. In the current biennium, we project total general fund spending will be $70.5 billion, a $998 million increase from end of session estimates. In the next biennium, the planning years, we project the general fund budget to be $66.2 billion, an increase of $982 million from end of session estimates. It is a little unusual to see a decline of that magnitude from biennium to biennium, and we'll talk about what's going on there a little more later in my presentation. But let's talk about what's driving this expenditure change. If you look at the top line, E-12 education, that's the largest portion of our state general fund budget. Our estimate is that in 2024, we'll spend $24.5 billion on education, which is $205 million more than our end of session estimates. As always, there are a lot of moving pieces in the education forecast, but this change is driven by two primary factors. First, pupil projections are about a half a percent higher than end of session estimates. And this is because school districts are seeing an increase in the number of recently arrived English learners, which is now factored into our data. In addition, we're seeing higher than projected spending on school meals. Our estimates now incorporate more recent data on the actual participation in the new free school meals program, and also factors in updated information about the cost of those meals. These trends continue into the next biennium, where we project $112 million in higher spending relative to end of session. However, they're moderated somewhat by decreases in compensatory aid and special education. Moving to the next line, Health and Human Services, you'll see this is the largest driver of changes in the spending forecast, with $495 million in higher spending projected in this forecast than previous estimates. In the current biennium, $564 million in the planning years. There are a few things going on in Health and Human Services. The largest is driven by an increase in our costs associated with long-term care waivers. The value of that is about $355 million in the current biennium and over $500 million in the planning years. We have seen increases in both the number of people being served through these programs as well as the average cost per person. And I'll get more into the enrollment forecast on a later slide. In addition to those changes, the state expects a lower federal share for medical assistance than we previously projected. And this is simply because the state's baseline federal matching rate is lower than we previously forecast. We projected to decline from 51.49% to 51.16%. This reduction is due to Minnesota's per capita income growing faster than national per capita income, which is what drives the federal matching rate. HHS spending is also higher in the first biennium only due to some temporary coverage extensions that were made to households as a part of the COVID public health emergency unwind. The Department of Human Services is in the process of undoing a number of coverage requirements during the COVID public health emergency, and among their strategies are things to ensure that our coverage isn't terminated in places where people should have maintained coverage due to federal compliance. These increases are offset partially by lower projected enrollment in some eligibility categories. The next line, property tax aids and credits, you can see is $163 million higher in the current biennium and $145 million above previous estimates in the next biennium. This is largely due to higher homestead and renters credit refunds, but in the planning years, we're also projecting increases in the school building bond agricultural credit as a result of higher agricultural land values and school debt service levies. On the next line, state debt service spending is forecast to be lower than previous estimates due primarily to a smaller than expected bond sale in 2023. On the next line, all other areas of the state budget are also up in both biennia, but for different reasons. In the first biennium, we project $174 million change, and this is simply because there are agencies who carried forward money from last year into the current biennium, and we now project them to spend it in 2024 or 2025. These changes are actually neutral to the general fund, and if you factored those out, the total spending increase would be closer to $800 million. But looking in the planning years where we see $112 million in higher spending in this all other line, that's due to the fact that the forecast is now picking up forecasted increase in the Metro Mobility Program. In 2019, the legislature passed a law saying that in 2026, Metro Mobility would move from a direct appropriated program to more of a forecast program, which means that instead of their appropriations being set at a steady level, they can change as program participation or costs grow. And this is the first time those costs are recognized in one of our forecasts. And the final line I'll talk about is the estimated inflation line. This is something the commissioner hinted to earlier. The legislature in February of this year enacted a law directing MMB to include inflation in our budget forecasts. We project the value of that inflation at $880 million in the planning years, which is a $63 million increase from our end of session estimates. The increase is driven by changes in sort of the size of the state budget as well as projected inflation in the planning years. This number represents the cost of funding current services at current levels in wake of rising cost pressures. We sometimes refer to the figure as discretionary inflation because we're only calculating it for programs or funding formulas don't already include factors to adjust for changing prices. However, policymakers get to decide whether or not to actually appropriate this $880 million for these purposes. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's going on in Health and Human Services, specifically around enrollment in our disability waivers. Disability waivers are a collection of services through medical assistance for people with disabilities, both children and adults, who need a level of care that would normally be provided in a nursing home, but choose to receive supports in their homes and communities. They serve people with a wide range of physical and developmental disabilities, brain injuries, and serious mental health needs. This chart illustrates enrollment in these programs over time and compared to our end of session estimates. In this forecast, caseload projections for disability waivers increased 2.1% in the current biennium and 3.2% in the next relative to our end of session estimate. This change drives a $165 million increase in the current biennium and $320 million in the tails. The increase from the previous forecast is driven by updated data, where we're seeing enrollment coming in higher than expected, and the expectation that growth will continue at a higher rate. You can see from this chart that increases in enrollment are not a new trend in these programs. Growth rates were relatively flat from 2010 to 2016 because of legislative enrollment caps that limited the number of new participants. During that time, there were wait lists for the programs because demand for services exceeded the number of new enrollees allowed. But between 2010 and 2023, the average monthly caseload has more than doubled from about 31,000 to 63,000. And that's due in part to in 2016, these legislative enrollment limits expired. Since then, monthly enrollment has grown by an average of 6% per year. Our forecast projects it to continue growing by an average of 4% per year from 2024 through 2027. I'd like to spend a minute looking at our annual spending levels to explain what's going on from biennium to biennium. As I mentioned, we project spending to decline from the current biennium to the next. And generally, state spending grows as the cost of providing services increase. But the decline is the result of significant one-time spending in the 2023 legislative session. Going into last year's budget setting session, there was a $17.5 billion surplus. However, only about a third of that represented ongoing resources, with the rest representing one-time revenues. The enacted budget contained many of these one-time uses in order to align with the available resources. In the chart, you can see the projected spending by year, and you can see that spending is declining significantly from 2024 to 2025, and even a slight decline from 2025 to 2026. Our estimate at the end of session was that approximately $9 billion of last session's appropriations in the current biennium were one-time and did not continue into the planning years. That included things like general fund cash for capital investment, housing, transportation, pensions, many other investments. And that $9 billion doesn't include one-time revenue reductions, such as one-time tax rebates. The chart provides useful context to explain what's going on in the state budget from biennium to biennium, but it's also a valuable example of how budgetary choices can attempt to align commitments with our available resources. With that, I will turn it back to Commissioner Campbell.
All right, just a couple more slides here and then we'll get to questions. This next slide shows the long-term budget outlook. When we think of the state's long-term budget outlook, we compare our forecast revenues against our projected spending for the current biennium and the next. That view is what we call our structural balance. However, the story about the out years is a little bit more complex in this forecast. As we showed earlier in our presentation, that's because of the impact of our record surplus from the previous biennium on the remaining balance at the end of FY27. On this slide, you can see that in both biennia, projected spending is set to outpace forecast revenues. In FY24-25, spending is at $70.5 billion compared to $59.7 billion in incoming revenues. Then, when looking at the structural balance in FY26 and 27, we're comparing $66.2 billion in expenditures to $63.9 billion in forecast revenues. Yet, because of the substantial surplus, we will end FY24-25 with $2.4 billion on the bottom line, assuming that balance is unspent. This amount carries forward into FY26-27. $2.3 billion in higher spending compared to our revenues in the out years means that we have an ongoing structural imbalance. The one-time surplus helps us end FY26-27 with $82 million as our remaining balance on the bottom line. Again, there's positive news in this forecast. Revenues are expected to grow, but having said that, with increasing spending, it appears policymakers should exercise caution when making budget decisions. This final chart illustrates the growth in our general fund budget reserve over the past decade. Since 2014, Minnesota has had a budget reserve target that's based on an annual analysis of revenue volatility. State law directs 33% of the November forecast balance to the reserve until the target is met. Our current target is 4.9% of general fund revenues in the current biennium. As you can see, our total cash flow and reserve amounts combined were about $1 billion in 2012 and now stand at nearly $3 billion, which includes the additional $61 million added to the reserve this forecast. As a result of our improved general fund balance, we were able to allocate that additional fund to the reserve, and that achieves our statutory target under what is a nation-leading budget reserve policy. Some of you may recall that it wasn't too long ago during the Great Recession that our reserve balance was at zero. Policymakers at the time had the foresight to ensure that even as our state saw steady economic improvement, that we were still allocating money to the reserve each November. In 2019, we hit our reserve target for the first time ever and have maintained a reserve at the target since that time. Having a substantial reserve is critical, not only because it is an important element of Minnesota's preparation in the event of an unexpected economic downturn, but it is also a key credit factor that rating agencies have used to award Minnesota's AAA credit rating from all three agencies. Rating agencies want to be sure that the state can weather an economic downturn. A full rainy day fund is a strong indicator. This is key to maintaining our high bond ratings, which lower the state's cost to finance capital projects. In summary, the outlook for this forecast period has a little bit of everything. The outlook for the U.S. economy has improved since the prior forecast. Consumer spending is up, and corporate profits are also up. These improvements point to steadiness on one side of the ledger. However, with rising costs of critical programs like services to Minnesotans with disabilities, school-aged children, the elderly, and others, it's increasingly important that we're mindful of our most important priorities when setting budgets. As a reminder, we are on strong footing. Our sound fiscal policy and planning has led to achieving our largest budget reserve to date, which is evidence of strong fiscal management. It's important that we maintain that strong fiscal management going forward. Ultimately, forecasts are intended to help inform the decisions of policymakers. Resources available last legislative session allowed for major investments, many of which were one-time in nature, in recognition that spending needed to be in line with resources. The update that we're providing today is that while we expect to end both biennia in our forecast period with a balance, the underlying structural imbalance is something we need to continue to monitor and be mindful of as we make budget decisions during the next legislative session and beyond. This will keep our state on sound fiscal footing and help maintain excellent financial management so that we can deliver on our commitments to Minnesotans. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Can I get a photo of slide 17?
Sure.
And walk us through those numbers. Come down to the bottom, 24, 25, after 2.92 million balance. It then flows into the next biennium, correct?
If unspent, yes.
So how do you get to 56, 55? What makes up the rest of that?
Anna, is that a question that you can answer?
The 5655 is the combination of the remaining balance and the budget reserve and cash flow accounts. So just the nature of our financial statements is we add the reserve as part of what flows in at the beginning of the biennium, and then we subtract it out on the table. It's 560. Yes, it should better. It does. Thank you.
Commissioner, can you talk a little bit more about the causes behind that projection?
Well, let me clarify that we're not projecting a deficit. We are projecting a structural imbalance, and
It's not fair to call it a deficit?
correct. It is not fair to call it a deficit. We have a positive balance at the end of each biennium. What we have is structural imbalance because our spending is exceeding our revenues. The distinction is because we have had surpluses that have carried over from biennia to biennium, and that is sort of blunting that impact. So we've talked through the increase in spending. So the spending, the largest single driver there is the disability waivers, amongst other things, as Anna outlined. And then, Dr. Kalambakidis, do you want to say anything about more about the revenues than what you've already indicated?
So revenues aren't declining biennium to biennium. We've added, and they're growing, and we've added money to our forecast for the current biennium. And then the second biennium is roughly flat. We've taken 30 million out. So it's just the structural imbalance is the difference between the revenues and spending in this chart.
But is it fair to say that increased costs, you talked about education being driver, is it increased cost of the free meals? Is it more participation?
It's both of those things as it relates to meals, and that is one part of the story. There are several different things that are ultimately driving the increase in spending. So one of them is the number of pupils, English language learners. Meals, as we discussed, that's both a result of the cost of the food and the number of pupils who are participating. As we talked about, we also are seeing increases in spending in HHS, including disability waivers, the Medicaid match, federal match, amongst other things.
How does the English learners, how does that impact the education spending?
That'll be an Anna question. Anna, can you help us?
So the English learners are just contribute to a higher pupil projection. So if you think most of our education forecast is based on how many kids are in our schools, and then what is the cost of educating them. And so we're projecting a 0.5% increase in pupils across the forecast horizon. And the largest driver is that we are seeing data that indicate there are more English language learners than we previously assumed. Does that answer your question?
Can we return to the difference between a structural balance and an actual imbalance and an actual deficit? Help us explain that to ordinary. What's the difference?
The difference is that you have a remaining balance from in this case, the difference is that we have a positive balance at the end of the previous fiscal years that's rolling over. And that is allowing us to maintain those spending levels without reaching a deficit.
Based on the trends we see here in this forecast for spending and for revenue, what other than spending cuts could actually prevent this imbalance in 26, 27, and going forward, even actually become an actual deficit year?
Well, it's important to note that we're just a few months into this particular biennium, so a lot could change over the course of the next 19 months. There are any number of factors. Ultimately, revenues could increase. Some of these numbers could some of the spending numbers could come down. We'll know more in the February forecast in terms of how those things are shaping out as we're further into the fiscal year.
How much more is the school budget costing so far, and how much higher? We have a little under 400 million. It's only the first half of the school year, but do you know so far?
We do have that number. Yep, just 1 second.
So school meals costing about, let me get the actual numbers. It's an increase about, and I'm going to find this for you, about $85 million this biennium, and about $81 million this biennium, and $95 million in the tails.
That's a projection based on how many kids are taking the lunches so far.
Yeah.
Compared to what you thought. And that's an increase over official estimate that the legislature accounted for in their spending. $80 million over that. Something it was.
That's right. And so it's both the participation increases, which are based on really preliminary and partial data, And then also we're basing the reimbursement the state is providing to school districts on USDA reimbursement levels, and those have gone up since last session. So we're sort of now better factoring in their sort of future growth over time, recognizing that they're sort of indexed to inflation and that this forecast needs to account for that as well. I think that's one of a number of policies enacted last session where the actual effects aren't factored into the forecast.
Can someone talk to me about July, Mark Ward talked about this year, bill, $352 million. How's that accounted for here? Is that the big statutory change that you have to off? Is that in here?
That is not factored in. That's a good question. It's not factored in. It's not factored in because the error was discovered after the end of the legislative session. It was not what was intended, and so legislative leaders and tax chairs sent a letter indicating that they plan to fix that early in the legislative session. And so understanding that, we've not included that $350 million in each fiscal year in these estimates. We have not. It is not included. The $350 million is not included. That would be an increase in revenue, and that is not shown. So keeping in mind that there's $880 million accounted for in inflation, which is like that money is not appropriated yet. That's discretionary inflation, and it reflects what would need to be appropriated in order to maintain current service levels. What I would say is that if whatever is spent this legislative session does have an impact on that $82 million on the bottom right-hand side of that chart, it'll drive down.
If I can follow up to Commissioner, and I know you don't want to get into the politics of this, but we already have multiple press releases, legislative leaders calling this Democrat deficit. Is that inaccurate?
I would not say that that's accurate. I think what you have here is we've got costs that are being driven by programs that have been around a very long time. Caps that came off in 2016 on those disability waivers. What we're seeing is a change in the economy is, what we know is that we actually have more stability than we've had in the past. There's less volatility, and we just have more constraint in our budget than we have had previously.
Once upon a time, without inflation.
In any case, what we are looking at right now is not considered a deficit.
Aren't all the signs pointing to if spending isn't curtailed, they don't carry over the balance, that the deficit could happen, whether the numbers here, structural balance, deficit, that terminology aside, that if spending continues at this rate, could a deficit happen in the future?
Sure, a deficit is possible in the future, and that depends on what happens this legislative session, and it depends on whether or not our projected spending continues at the same rate, if it's higher, if it's lower. It depends on whether or not our revenues come in as projected, higher or lower. So there are a number of different things that are ultimately driving that factor, but certainly one outcome could be a deficit.
Just in a similar vein, would you or would you not attribute the structural imbalance to spending from the previous session?
I would not. There are some of the drivers come from decisions that were made last legislative session, but that's just a part of the story.
You just said that the school meals is an example of something that was passed last session.
Right, that's why I said it's a part of the story, but it's not the whole story.
That's like $80 billion, and you're talking about $80 billion. What's on the bottom line right now? That was like double. You have to be more.
Yeah, so as you can see, the increased spending is projected to be $998 million.
will that come in the next bond? Have that value back?
The reason is we issue bonds based on our projections for spending needs. So we talk to projects where the legislature has authorized them. So and then say, are you ready? Like, are you ready to spend the money now? So we don't issue more bonds than we really need. And what we learned this summer is there were fewer needs. So agencies and local governments didn't need the cash at the moment, and so we issued just over $400 million less bonds than the forecast assumed. But to your second question, yes, we do then project our next bond sale will be bigger as we sort of play catch up.
So it wasn't a factor that the rates were so high, you decided not to sell it. In hopes that the rates would come down. You got what you needed out of it.
Yeah, it's purely as a result of cash flow analysis of the currently authorized projects, and then the fact that there wasn't a 2022 bonding bill.
And speaking of bonding bill debt capacity, what's there and what's safe?
What we are assuming in this forecast is $830 million for a bonding bill. That's in general obligation bonds, trunk highway funds. That is a little bit lower than you might be accustomed to at 880. That's been the 10-year average. The reason that's a little bit lower is because we're getting closer to one of our debt guidelines. We have 3 debt guidelines. It's number 3 that we are approaching. And so we have adjusted the number in the forecast to reflect what we could actually bond for to stay within that guideline.
So is that part of the caution you were urging? Also caution in bonding, not just
Yes.
Is there an underlying reason that disability waivers are expected to rise?
It's a complicated. The answer is complicated, and I think it's something that we have to understand better. I mean, at the end of the day, there are more people who are in the program, and I think that is. I don't know if Anna would like to say anything further about that, but there could be many factors, including determinations being made at a county level in terms of who qualifies for what program.
I can't speak to how our disability waiver spending compares to other states, but I do want to just remind folks of this chart that shows the trend in disability waiver enrollment, and clearly the enrollment is part of the story, also average cost. So we saw an increase in enrollment relative to end of session, but also we've seen a significant increase over time, almost doubling from 2010 to or more than doubling from 2010 to 2023. And if you see the relatively flat line from 2010 to 2015, that was a time when we had legislative enrollment caps, so that we had wait lists because there were more people who wanted to access the service than the law allowed. Since that time, since the end of these enrollment limits, enrollment has grown fairly quickly, and we expect at some point for that to level off, but it has not happened, hasn't happened yet.
really quickly, I was looking at my notes from the February forecast, and former Commissioner Showalter said that there was an expectation that structurally revenues, at least at that point in time, that structurally revenues would exceed spending. I'm wondering, did anything change in the calculation that would cause it to swing this way, or is it just simply that for all of the numbers we just mentioned, that spending exceeded what they had projected in a significant enough way?
I would say it's the latter.
Can you go back to 17 one more time, please? The question is, if revenues were expected to exceed spending, wouldn't you call it a projected surplus?
We do have a projected surplus in 24-25.
Okay.
I'm happy to talk to you afterwards to try to answer your questions.
But in 26, 27, you would call it a positive structural balance, not call it surplus in that budget. The budget has not.
Yeah, we would say we're in balance, that we are in balance, if that were the case. We would not have that we do, Peter has praised it correctly. So what we would say is that we have a positive structural balance if that were to be the case. Sorry? Is illegal? Yeah, we would, yes, in a current biennium, we would not be able to do that. So, see that the governor is here, so thank you for your time.
Well, good afternoon. Peter will be clarifying all my remarks for me here today, so good to see all of you. First of all, a thank you to the professional teams, Commissioner Campbell at MMB, Dr. Klamakidis, our state economist, and of course, Budget Director Anna Mingy. These folks spend a lot of time on this. Unlike many of us, they are CPAs. They are deep in this. They spend a lot of time preparing, and they brief us starting early this morning. So I got a chance to see these numbers at 8 o'clock this morning and start to do what you're doing is starting to parse through them. I think that the top line on this, a thank you to the people of Minnesota, hardworking folks with very high labor participation rate, an economy that continues to grow, is producing jobs, some of the highest per capita incomes in the country, and overall very solid. But I think I would mix that in with what you heard from them. We need to be measured on how we approach this. One thing that I'm very proud of that we insisted was done, I came into this job insisting that you cannot give forecasts without including inflation. So every other time you've heard this here, you could certainly distort those numbers by pulling down $880 million on inflationary needs that were in there. That is no longer true. Something else Minnesota does that not many states do, we project 4 years into the future. The vast majority do 2 years, which would be the current biennium, showing this surplus. I think it's a much better vision to get over the horizon, and it puts us as one of 16 states with a AAA bond rating. With that being said, huge thank yous to the legislature last year who worked on priorities that are important for us to look to towards future, whether it's 26, 27, or more importantly, 2035 and 2040 of what is the economy going to look like in Minnesota? Where are the growth areas going to be? And where are the vulnerabilities that we can control, whether it be workforce, education, housing, childcare, many of the things that we know in the long run bring down costs around that. So I'm incredibly proud of it. It was a nation-leading child tax credit. It was reducing Social Security tax. All those things are revenue declines, but then turning around in investments and making sure that our children are fed. And as you heard in this, many of those things, many of the impacts of this are not captured in this forecast. One of the things that we know is when children get enough to eat and they reach a certain calorie count, educational attainment goes up. Once we see families that are stable in housing, we see much better economic activity. And when you see a state that's focusing, whether it be around medical and biotech, or whether it be clean energy, just this last week or so, we saw $5+ billion investment in Rochester, and we saw Hellion up on the Iron Range investing in our clean technology. So I think this is good news. You see on the slides that we're up here with a $2.4 billion surplus, but what I would say is, and some of you can do the math on that, if you draw a little diagonal between those two lines, if we're cautious on this, we balance out in the out years in a very positive way. And I think that in those investments that went on the front end, we start to see those benefits come in. Again, Minnesota is performing strongly. The numbers still continue to come in. We knew that a lot of this was one-time funding. You're seeing a lot of bridges. I was in St. Cloud yesterday. Nation-leading water treatment plant, totally self-sufficient, produces its own power, sells it back to the grid, also sells the byproducts of that waste plant back to farmers at a profit for that. So the city of St. Cloud leading on many of these things. So the investments we make in bonding, which I think this year is a bonding year, is where we should focus. We should have a solid bonding bill in this. We should take these numbers into consideration. We should leave money on the bottom line as we've done. We have historic surpluses in our rainy day and reserve funds, and then we start to see the payoffs in the investments that we made. So I'm grateful to the folks who worked on this, grateful to Speaker Hortman, Leader Dietzig, the folks in the legislature who make these investments. We're going to see historic job creation, especially in the construction trades, which we're already seeing across the state, whether it be roads and bridges, Blotnick Bridge, Mayo Clinic, all across the state. All of those things will start to generate back into what we know is preparing the economy for the future, preparing our workforce for the future, making those investments in people that will make a difference for the future. And all of those things are a positive. So with that, I'd be glad to take a few questions.
What about the more expensive than expected breakfast for all kids?
Yes. Yeah, when I first got down to Rochester in the first month, the city of Rochester, I think we use it as an example. It's one of our wealthiest cities where we saw a 17% increase in that. What we know is these are investments in children. We know that those investments, again, it's pretty hard to characterize as wasteful spending when we're seeing more children get healthy meals in school so they're ready to learn. A 17% increase in the early days of people using that. And what was really interesting, some of the notes that I get, I had a mother from Grand Rapids write, it wasn't the students who qualified for free and reduced lunch and weren't being able to fill out the paperwork. She said they were fully middle class. They did not qualify for meals, but it was too expensive to have her 3 children get those. Now her children want to eat school meals. They get them, and she said her morning is far less stressful. She's not preparing and packing meals, and she's saving the money. And so I think we'll see as these things settle out, when you have these new programs, you'll have less spending in some areas, higher spending in other areas. We start to get inside that, start to get that balance. But that's an investment that I will defend all day. I would like to see every student take us up on that, and we'll make the case how to pay for that.
Would you be willing to cut spending and start putting these numbers?
Well, this is out, and remember, this is 26, 27. I'll tell you what I'm not willing to do. I'm not going to give billionaires tax cuts to do this, and I'm certainly not going to take food out of the mouths of children. The issue on this is we're running a $2.5 billion surplus. You could just move that right over to the bottom, and that would be it. I would make the case that the folks in St. Cloud would like to see their water treatment plant done, and if we're in communities where you can't add any more economic activity because you're not building it, we need to be smart about that. But I will tell the legislature, and I've been saying this for quite some time, we did a lot of great work last year. It's time to implement that. It will have a positive impact on workforce development, positive impact on housing, positive impact on the environment, which is helping us build some of this clean energy economy. But we need to be measured. We need to be cautious. This is not the year. So I think we need to be measured. We're not going to give tax cuts to millionaires, and we're not going to spend excessively on things. And so I think at this point in time, give a chance for some of these things to go in. Give a chance for some of them to work. Our responsibility is in this biennium. We do something, and again, for years, people fought this idea of putting inflation into the factor. That is a huge piece of it. That is $1 billion of this is inflationary on that. So you're getting a really accurate picture here. You're getting really ready to ever see these things go. And I do think this issue that we're going to have to, and we're going to have to understand more, is the disability waivers. That makes up half of this. What happened in 2015 makes up half of what the deficit was for the 1 year, or the potential spending piece of that. We need to understand, but I want to be very clear on this. These are our most vulnerable citizens. The 2 pieces that got brought up here is our most vulnerable citizens who were stuck in a waiting line, not getting the services they needed, and children getting meals. I think we'll figure out a way to make sure that we can defend those programs and see how they build to the future.
Message to groups that want a lot of money, additional spending from the legislature this year. Like there's a headline right now about U of M taking up to $80 million for healthcare initiatives there. I mean, that wipes out that $80 million bottom line.
Well, yeah, this is what we'll do. This is what we'll do over the next 5 months. But mine is be measured on this. We've done this. We've got this thing balanced, a surplus created. We know that economically the United States is still, with the rest of the world, still coming out of some uncertainty. We're in a much better shape than any place else. But I think now is the time to be measured on this. I would ask them to take a hard look at this. The legislature will take a look. You're looking at the bottom line numbers on that. But again, on some of this, those who are going to say, cut all the spending, give tax cuts to these. We've seen that doesn't work. The trickle down doesn't work. But I would tell them, look, we do need to be measured. We need to be careful about where we spend money. The legislature will do what they do. They will debate these. They will triage, and they will put together a budget. I can assure you our budget will be limited. It will be focused on a responsible bonding bill that includes the entire state and projects that matter. And then it will be very focused on implementing policies that we need to get done.
Bonding at less than $1 billion.
Pardon me?
Bonding at less than $1 billion.
Well, I recall when I had my first discussions in this in 2019, I was told by Republican leaders, you will never see a bonding bill over $1 billion, ever, those discussions. And we never had one before that. We've done some of those. I think what we changed is we have a more flattened pattern on this. We had a good one last year. We have federal funds coming in on the IIJA and the CHIPS Act and the IRA at levels we haven't seen. I want to thank the legislature once again for doing all the matching funds that were factored into what we need to do for that. So I think that's probably the neighborhood where we'll be. And I don't think disappointed. This is budgeting. This is what you do. You manage it. And I will just have to say this. You don't have to guess to the future. My administration's been doing this for 5 years. We've navigated the most volatile economic situation since the Great Depression. And we've done so by balancing the budget with surplus while investing heavily in the middle class and cutting taxes for the middle class. Those are things that I think you can expect to see. So sure, maybe this is maybe not the year to go a little bigger than that, but I can assure you is we are going to be responsible, measured, balanced, and we're going to continue to deliver those programs, whether it be meals or whether it be the disability services or whether it be roads and bridges and water treatment plants. Yeah, we're going to have the legislature talk about this, and we're going to talk about this. But the one thing that I think we've been steady about, and I'm very proud of this. I think it's a legacy thing that I'm proud for our administration, that I insisted that inflation be included on how we do things. And this is simply the numbers. This is the numbers. This is what we have to work within. We have a lot of things yet to implement. We are not seeing the benefits of many of these yet. They're not factored in. And I think that's the one thing. And again, they can't project, Dr. Klambakidis can't project what the impact of kids with solid homes and with housing, with food, or the impacts of paid family and medical leave that increases worker productivity and allows the state to recruit more workers. So I think I'm just going to tell them, look, these are the numbers. We had an incredible legislative session that invested in folks. We've got a lot of work to do on implementation. We are in a solid place. We should do a bonding bill. We should prioritize those projects, and then we should take a hard look and triage where it makes sense. But I think, as you can see, we're in a good spot. It's there, this structural deficit issue that comes up. The good news in Minnesota is this is a decision that will be made in the 25 budget year, because this biennium is set. It's coming in with a surplus. It's going. But we can see over the horizon the flashing yellow a little bit to take a look at that. We'll have the opportunity to make that. So I think people should temper where they're going. They should temper where they're at. That includes spending. That's going to come from allies of mine, and Republicans are not going to get their millionaire tax cut. It's not going to happen because it doesn't fit the budget. It's too early to, it's too early to have these conversations. I don't think that's the case of this. Again, remember, we're in a surplus situation where we're currently at, and we get a chance now to implement the smartness of going over the horizon, the smartness of having the nation leading. Again, I remind everyone, the rainy day funds are above and beyond this at $3 billion, above and beyond the 2.4 that's there. And we have every reason to believe, look, in a $30 billion state budget, we just had a $5 billion private investment going in that is going to create, again, take all the stadiums we built, they're smaller than what the Mayo Clinic did. We have 130 jobs being created at Hellion. All these things are starting to go. I think it's way too early to talk about that. And I've always said this. You've heard me stand up here every time I said, it's disingenuous not to say, look, everything's on the table. What I can tell you is I'm not cutting meals for kids or services to our most vulnerable to give tax cuts to the folks at the top. We did, and I'm very proud of this, whether it be the Social Security tax cut or the child tax credit. Those were big. And again, in this ledger, tax cuts are expenditures. Tax cuts are expenditures, and that's the way we're going to continue to balance budgets, by being fair.
We had some bad news from Treasury about taxation of prepaid checks. What happened there? I thought you knew the president.
Bullshit. I don't know. We did it here. I say this, that it's the IRS. I will tell you this. I have been on the phone, not much more judicious than that slip there, to let them know. And I spoke to the President's Chief of Staff yesterday when this became clear. Look, Minnesota's being treated unfairly in this. They picked an arbitrary date to end the emergency on May 11th. The legislature did not get finished and sign them over until the 26th, so we missed by 15 days. Every other state was afforded this, and they say, well, we've got to have a red line in the sand. So I deeply disappointed, and I think the idea, if they even think about, downplaying that it's $26, I will have even harsher words than I started with, because it's just not right.
Are we getting it's too early to the benefits or cost savings from the House last session, the changes? When will we start to see these things?
Dr. Klambakidis? So I've asked this, and I think for many of us to know, look, we have many of these programs are going to take time to stand up, paid family and medical leave, the implications of a child having enough food to eat and not losing that, not entering either into the social service system, criminal justice system. When do you expect to start seeing?
Well, they may be creating benefits now, but it takes a while before it shows up in the economic data. So I need to see the economic data showing evidence of increased labor force participation, things like that.
And I'll just give, on the child tax credit's one I feel most confident about. We saw the reduction in that and the bump up in economic activity that happened with family during the pandemic on a federal level. And when that program stopped, childhood poverty went back up about 6 or 7%, higher in some states, bounced back up again, and we know the cost of that we can start to measure. So that one we think we'll start to see in a relatively quick manner.
Yeah, a broad stroke, I guess, what would be legislative game plan, if you will, upcoming session?
They'll be up here. You can ask them, I think. Yeah, that's what normally happens here. Look, I'm going to be very clear on this. Those who know me, I am not shy to show them my 850 personal credit score because I work really hard on that. I'm pretty fiscally conservative on these things, and I've shown that as the time we've been up here to make those things balance. We are going to ask them to take care of people, invest in the middle class, implement the things we need to do, but this is a live within our means, and this is good news. This is good news. We're not ready. Some of you said in here with deficits, and I recall too, just so we're clear, we've had forecasts in 2020 that projected $5 billion deficits. By the time we came back in November, it was $3 billion surpluses. So this gives us, and I would tell people, take this seriously. Proceed measured as we go. Use this as a guidepost for what we're doing, but understanding that we're investing. Look, there's been experiments on this. We've seen states like Kansas, back in the early 2000s said, no, we got an experiment here. We're going to cut taxes and cut services, and the economy blew up. And so I'm just telling them, stay the course, but recognize on this is not going to be like last year. It's not a budget year. It's a supplemental budget year. I think it's going to be a very measured inside the parameters that are here. And then let's get a better look. We'll get a better look in February and get a better look next November. Because remember, this is good through the biennium. Surplus is there through the biennium. Again, I keep saying if we go back to the slide, oh no, it's right here. Remember, spending was up, all the spending up stories. Spending is down on this. So it's down, so spending is down. And these things will start to balance out. So that one-time spending, the surpluses that were created, the growth that we have the potential for, Minnesota having, again, strong labor force, strong opportunities, but approach this legislative session measured. Yep. Those will all be discussions the legislature will talk about. I think we just need to be measured. I think the good news is that we have a luxury of being able to talk about a balanced budget, a state that's economy is growing, opportunities for folks. Again, middle class folks starting to see the benefits of that. But those are discussions that will happen. I don't think, again, you don't stop on everything. You as a family don't stop. But if you see that you've got some unexpected expenses, or if you see revenues not up in that, you just balance accordingly. You start to think a little more modestly about how you're going to do this, but you don't stop those things that continue to grow the economy. So what I'm most excited about is all of those things that we know, all those things that we implemented, that we know make Minnesota a destination, a place where we said it's the best place to raise your family and your kids. We're seeing that pay off in some of these investments. And I'll go back to it and end with, just to be very clear, Mayo Clinic didn't invest $5 billion out of nostalgia. They didn't invest $5 billion just because they started here. They invested $5 billion because this was the best place to do it. This had the best workforce, the best cluster of things around them, and the best opportunity for them to get the results they want. And I think that is true for all these businesses who are making that case. And I think those who will come up here and tell you that folks are going to leave Minnesota, they're going to do this or whatever, first of all, the data doesn't support that. Secondly, that's not who we are as people. So I'm pretty excited to see what's coming on this. I think, again, this is good news. It's good biennium. It's working the way it needs to be. We have an opportunity as a legislature to smooth things out and even get into the further out. But let's come back in February. The legislative session will have just started. We'll have a lot clearer picture on which direction that is, and that should inform us on how we go. So I want to thank all that, and I'm not sure who's up next. Thank you.
Oh shoot, the smart people are leaving. Well, good afternoon. It's a great day in Minnesota. I'm pleased to share with you that our candidate won last night in 52B, so we are back to 70 strong in the Minnesota House DFL caucus. It's also a great day in Minnesota because we have a balanced budget this biennium and the next. Today's economic forecast shows that Democrats are growing the economy in Minnesota. The policies that we've enacted are supporting Minnesota's workers, reducing costs for families, and growing the labor force. The best way to support the economy is to support workers. We've shown that. The proof is in the pudding. Last session, we enacted a budget that will benefit Minnesotans for generations to come. Our budget is already growing the economy by growing the middle class, and it has strengthened our state's economic security. As the budget that we passed continues to be more fully enacted, it will ensure that even more Minnesotans have opportunities and tools to build better lives for themselves and their families. Minnesotans see a Democratic state legislature and a Democratic governor who value their contributions as workers and who have enacted policies to ensure that they get the pay, the benefits, and the working conditions that they deserve. And Minnesotans are responding to the Democratic pro-worker policies by choosing to work in record numbers, giving Minnesota nation-leading labor participation rate, nation-leading high employment, and nation-leading low unemployment. Our labor participation rate is the fourth highest in the country at more than 68%. We have the highest number of Minnesotans working in state history, 3 million people, surpassing our pre-pandemic high of 2.9 million people working. And our unemployment rate of 3.2% is lower than the national average of 3.9%. The policies that we enacted with Democratic leadership in the House, Senate, and Governor's office have resulted in economic success and stability. Policies like paid family medical leave, earned safe and sick time, and increased worker protections, whether you work in a warehouse or a refinery, gave workers the peace of mind they need to choose to participate in the workforce. These recently enacted policies are providing a strong foundation for our state's economic success. In the 2023 session, Democrats also cut costs for families to help their paychecks go further. Our investments this session in childcare, for example, have already resulted in savings for Minnesota families. The Prior Lake New Horizon sent a letter to parents informing them that because of legislative investments in childcare, their bills would be reduced by 6 to 7%, and I have the letter. I can share it with you. At the same time, our economy continues to do well and corporate profits are soaring. There are some Minnesota families that aren't feeling that in their own personal family budgets. And you'll see in the 2024 session, Democrats continuing to focus on growing the middle class, lowering costs, and reducing stress in people's lives. You heard the governor talk about not having to make lunch in the morning, not having to refill that lunch account. That's just one of the ways that Democrats have worked to reduce stress in family lives. While DFLers worked to lower costs for families, Republicans and their allies continue to work to protect corporate profits, which we've seen are at record highs. The most recent example is the pharmaceutical lawsuit suing to stop policies that Democrats enacted, and only one Republican voted for, to prevent pharmaceutical companies from charging excessive prices on drugs that people need. Even before the details of the budget forecast were fully out, Republicans were talking about tax cuts that benefit the wealthy and corporations and would gut investments that Minnesotans are counting on to cut costs for their families. When they had power, Republicans blocked policies that would help cut costs for their families. For 4 years, Governor Walz and I tried very hard to get Republican leaders to enact the kind of child care investments that are resulting in a 6 to 7% decrease in costs for the New Horizon families in Prior Lake, as an example. It took Minnesota voters deciding in 2022 to return Democrats to the House, to return a Democratic governor, and to give Democrats the Minnesota Senate for these common sense cost-cutting measures to be enacted to help the middle class. As we look forward to the 2024 session, our highest priority and our focus will be the bonding bill.
We look forward to putting together a capital investment bill that meets the needs all across the state. And we're hoping for good bipartisan support for a robust bill. We'll continue working with Senate Leader Dietzick, the governor, Minnesotans, and all legislators to deliver a budget that will make Minnesota a place that works better for everyone.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carrie Dietzick. I'm pleased to be here. As we face global unrest and economic uncertainties, we take seriously our responsibility to enact a wise budget. Coming into this year, with the new Senate majority, Minnesotans told us they want to get things done. We listened to them. We worked with Governor Walz, the Speaker, our House and Senate colleagues, and we led. We enacted a budget that will improve the lives of Minnesotans for generations. As that budget is implemented, Minnesotans will see the surplus returned to them in many ways that not only put money in their pockets, but also increases economic security and will provide opportunities for them and their families. They'll see major investments in roads and bridges and infrastructure. And these investments will provide good jobs for people, and it will provide economic activity in communities across the state. We passed a tax bill last year that included property tax refund increases and a child tax credit that will reduce child poverty. We also increased funding to local governments, county governments, and schools that will help keep down property taxes. Minnesotans will see investments in child care that families, businesses, and communities told us was very important. Many families with kids are getting a lunchbox tax cut with free school meals, and thousands of students will soon benefit from free college tuition as they prepare to enter the workforce. We put money towards nursing homes that will help families, communities, and the seniors that need to be in a safe and secure place. They will also see investments in housing, healthcare, and our schools that will make a real difference and grow the economy for the middle class. We are creating an economy that works for everyone. But we also know that our work is not done. Since the session ended, we have been out meeting and listening to Minnesotans to find out what their priorities are as we prepare for 2024. In the coming weeks, the Senate DFL caucus will be discussing those priorities, and we will continue to work with the governor, the speaker, and our colleagues on how to continue to move this state forward. Thank you. Now we'll take questions.
So is 830 the number for the bonding bill then?
Yeah, so that's the number that is in the forecast, is it's 830. We had been talking 880, but because of what they talked about, the three different levers that we have to use, it's 830 is probably the number.
For the GO.
Yeah.
We will work, we might as well stay up here. Huh?
Sure.
We will work together to find out what the number is for the cash bill. The agreement that we reached last year between the Senate leader and me and the governor, we have about $876 million that we didn't spend yet that we retained for capital investment. Now, in light of the forecast, we'll revisit that and make sure that we're still all on board. But we do have an agreement that we signed.
But in light of breaking that $1 billion barrier, is it disappointing to not have to go back down?
No, I think it would be shocking if we had a bonding bill that was less than $1 billion, because there's always a cash component and a GO component. So the GO component at 830, even if we did a very small cash component, we would still break $1 billion. But that, of course, counts on bipartisan support. And I was really pleased that we were able to work successfully with Senator Johnson and Leader Demuth to enact a bonding bill that we achieve with bipartisan support. And I'm hopeful we'll be able to do that again.
But people who come to any legislature with spending requests will next year as well, what do you tell them based on these numbers, particularly?
So we've already had conversations with some of our members and some of the advocates, at least I have talked to them on, let's wait and see what the forecast actually looks like. We implemented a lot last year, we did a lot last year, and we need to make sure that the agencies are actually getting done what we asked them to do last year, that money is getting moved in the way that we wanted to, and then at some point we should be able to look at, is it actually helping the way we want it to help? But there are a lot of needs. If you go and talk about needs, Senator Pappas, I know Representative Lee, they have been on bonding tours. Senator Pappas has had some that, they start at 7 in the morning and they are going till 11 o'clock at night, and they are touring towns all across the state and looking at a lot of water infrastructure needs, a lot of local road needs. There's just a lot of infrastructure needs across the state. And so, we'll be having that conversation because as the economy continues to grow, we have record employment, we have low unemployment. Some people are still struggling, and so we want to make sure, how do we help lift everybody up?
You're not ruling out some new spending program that
Well, the numbers are a little bit seared in my brain, but they're not on the screen behind us anymore. But you'll recall there was an asterisk at the bottom of the slide that said the forecasted spending in 26 and 27 presumes the expenditure of $880 million in inflationary adjustments to programs. So that means that there's a presumption that the legislature would include $880 million in spending. Now, if that doesn't happen, of course, the number 82 on the bottom line could grow, right? It could be bigger. And it also depends on the economy. Dr. Kolomakidis probably talked to you about the drop in projections for the national economy 2 years out. Well, Minnesota is exceeding the national economy in all measures when you look at economic success. So if we don't track the national numbers in economic growth 2 years from now, we'll have more on that bottom line in 26 and 27. That's just if we're at the same level of growth as the national average.
Majority Leader, last week, one of your members rolled out child care assistance, $500 million is the price tag on that. Can you do something like that?
We did $316 million this year. We addressed child care in 7 different bills, from the tax bill to education bill to higher ed bill to health and human services bill to the bonding bill. And so we are still hearing that child care is a big issue across the state. And so we'll at least have the discussions. We told them, make that bill scalable. They said it's scalable, said, give us more data. And we'll continue to have those conversations because that is what we are hearing from Minnesotans.
Madam Speaker, do you have some general message to kind of the unmet needs groups as they come in a non-budget year?
Yeah, it's really difficult. State government can't meet all the needs that are out there. There certainly are unmet needs out there. And when we talk about a projected surplus, we're not necessarily saying that all of the needs that exist in the state of Minnesota have been fully funded. And I think Representative Pinto had a phenomenal hearing, I think it was around November 13th, on the needs in childcare that are still out there. So it's wonderful for those families at the Prior Lake New Horizon, and I'm sure other New Horizons, who got a 6 to 7% decrease in their rates. But for some families, that's still a whole bunch of money that they're spending in childcare that it makes things tight for them. Do I wish we could do more on childcare? I certainly do. Do we have the revenue to do it? It doesn't look like right now we have the ability to make an additional commitment. We'll see what the numbers show in February. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you very much for being here this afternoon. Really an interesting day. I had to come early today just to see exactly how DFL would describe the budgetary reality that we're looking at here before us. Here's the reality, folks. Starting in 2018-19 budget, we had a surplus of $638 million. 20 and 21, we had $3.1 billion. 22-23, we had $9.49 billion surplus. 24-25 forecast in February, we had a projected surplus. And with it was $17.5 billion surplus, and then $10 billion of increases in taxes and fees What we see today in the February forecast is a $10 billion deficit. I will say that again, it is a deficit. No matter what the semantics that we've heard today, no matter how they spin this is a deficit. Republicans have worked so incredibly hard at building a budget that balances the needs of Minnesota and also does a great job of stewarding the resources that we were given in this state to provide for things like public safety, for education, for our roads and bridges across this state. And yet we saw that squandered in this last budget. And now we're going to have to figure out ways of getting back to the place that we were of stability in this state. But we don't see an appetite from that from the DFL. What we see is a continued appetite for spending more and more money going forward in programs through different aspects going forward this next year. Proposals that have been already brought up for that $2.4 billion budgetary surplus. And we talked a little bit about budgetary versus structural. So that's, it's the difference of paying your rent with your rebate check. Well, that's only a one-time thing, right? That'll only come in one time. But with the structural is where we need to be focused. And right now, looking at the numbers, it really breaks it down on page 10 of the document that we're given just prior to this hearing today, or to the announcement today, which really breaks it down and says in 24-25, we are already going to be in a deficit situation there. This is something that Republicans need to be focused on, that we have focused on over the last few years. If you look at our budgets, you'll see that over and over again. And now with single party control, in 1 year, they have completely eviscerated that. I'm incredibly disappointed at the language that was used today to hide that from you as reporters, but also from Minnesotans, trying to mask what's actually going on in the state. It's time that we get back to some reasonable governing. We need to make sure that that happens real soon. But this budget really reflects the priorities of what happened last session and what they've done to this state. With that, before we take questions, I want to turn it over to Representative Robbins.
Hi, I'm Representative Kristen Robbins. I'm from District 37A. And before I talk about the forecast, I just wanted to offer my condolences and acknowledge the passing of our former colleague, John Polston. He passed from ALS, and our prayers and thoughts are with his family. So, turning from that, I mean, the bottom line, as was said by the MMB presenters, is that spending is expected to exceed revenues. That's a deficit, my friends. And so that's what we have to get a handle on. And the numbers prove that out if you dig in the document. And I'm just very concerned that with $2.4 billion surplus in the 24-25 year, that then translates into a $2.3 billion structural deficit in the 26-27 year. Like, if we do nothing, we will just barely be keeping the budget in balance. And clearly, there are all these requests coming in daily for new spending. We cannot afford it. What we saw in the last session was that the Democrats spent $17.5 billion in surplus. They raised taxes $10 billion. They grew the government by nearly 40%. And now we are seeing the results of that. We sounded the alarm last session. This is going to set us up for future deficits. No one paid attention, but now we have the numbers that prove that that's exactly what happened. Minnesotans are paying $12,978 more every year just to keep pace with what their family budgets were in January of 2021. Minnesotans cannot afford more taxes. They cannot afford to grow government anymore. We need to have a very serious look at the ongoing spending that was created this last session and really set priorities. Everything cannot be the priority. And so I'm grateful that the forecast was accurate, I think, in showing that this is going to create ongoing deficits. I hope that we will hold the legislature's feet to the fire to not enact new spending. We cannot afford it. Minnesota families are overtaxed, and we need to put an end to this growing government.
Can you afford tax cuts?
You know, I think it's going to be a tough conversation. I don't know that tax cuts could be on the table. Last time, when we had the 17.5, was the time to do permanent tax cuts so that we could provide real relief to families. And they squandered that opportunity. They recklessly spent $17.5 billion and added additional $10 billion in taxes. And that opportunity may be lost, but we need it. Minnesota is not competitive. Our lowest tax rate is 5.35%. That is higher than the highest tax rate in 25 other states. We need tax cuts so families will stay here, so people will invest here, so we can attract new workers here. And this budget shows they wasted that opportunity last year.
And you heard the governor even say that he wants to be fiscally conservative. And if we want to be fiscally conservative, we can't build budgets that project a deficit in it from the get-go. And that's what we have here, is budgets that have built-in deficits. So we have to take a look at the spending, figure out what's going to happen there. But I just look at this, look at what's happening to our state budget, and we got to take a different approach to this. Clearly, the trifecta has taken a route that has broken the state's budget. We need to balance in this government again, and we don't have that right now. So we need to take a look at that. Where we cut, so we had a $17.5 billion surplus. They raised $10 billion. Democrats raised $10 billion of taxes, spent it all on both ongoing and one-time spending. Look, we need to prioritize where our spending is going. We need to prioritize education. We need to prioritize public safety. We need to prioritize our roads and bridges. That's where we need the money to go. That's what we need to look at. We need to make sure that we're giving tax cuts to families, make life more affordable. You know, Representative Robbins just talked about how much more expensive it is for Minnesota families. That's what we've done in this previous budget. That's what Democrats have done in this previous budget. We need to start turning that around. It's helping some families. You're right, but we already had something in place for that. We need to make sure that education for our kids is top-notch in this nation, and investing that way. You know, the meals, we'll see what academic, I know the governor was very high on the different ways that it's going to produce academic outcomes, but we need to take a peek at, okay, that's $400 million plus a year that's going to that program. Is that going to have the impact that we really want? Is it going to change it from what it was before? We'll see what that looks like, but you know, we're really concerned about having nation-leading education in this country.
What about bonding? We have heard that capacity is under $1 billion. If they're going to borrow, they need to
You know, our caucus hasn't met or discussed this yet, but my concern is that if they say that it's going to take another $880 million just to meet keeping up with inflation, I don't know how, you know, you can have a bonding bill, you can keep up with inflation, you can have all these other programs. So I think we'll have to take a serious look at that. There was a huge bonding bill last year. I think our caucus is open to it, but I think it would have to be limited and targeted. And, you know, obviously we'll discuss it as a caucus. I did want to mention, I thought it was interesting, they talked about the school lunch program as a lunchbox tax cut. But then they also talked about how Republicans always want all these tax cuts for millionaires. I serve on the tax committee. I did not see any Republican proposals for tax cuts for millionaires last session. But the lunchbox tax cut, the people that make a lot of money that didn't qualify for the free and reduced lunch previously, the wealthy families got that lunchbox tax cut. I'm sorry, but all the low-income students who need and we want to provide, make sure no one goes hungry, they were getting it through the free and reduced lunch program. This gave it to free lunch to all the wealthy families. So that's a place I think we need to look at. Is that really a priority that all the families of means who could make their child's lunch and can afford their child's lunch, do they need to get free lunch? I'm not sure, but it's something we need to take a look at. So that lunchbox tax cut was for the wealthy.
Well, as Representative Robbins and her caucus, they haven't talked about that specifically. We haven't had that debate yet. However, I know early on, Representative Portman had talked a little bit about maybe some cash involved with that, but we see based on the budget projections here, I don't know how much room there's going to be for cash in that bonding bill itself. 82 million at the max, it looks like on that. So really, it's going to be a borrowing, and I know we're getting close in some respects to our debt service limits. So we have to be looking at that as well. So you balance all these things out with the needs across Minnesota. We're open to have that discussion, but we want to make sure that we're prudent about that. And we're going to have a large discussion about that within our caucus.
In the previous session, policy was tax cuts. I mean, what is the goal become this session now that tax cuts seems like are not quality?
I think there's a lot of policy reform we need to take a look at, and this is the policy year, not the budget year. So for example, if we're looking for a place to save money, I would say a place we could look is the new office that's at DEED that's going to implement the paid family leave law. $400 million to create a new state agency within DEED to implement that. When we offered an alternative that was voluntary, that didn't create a whole new state office at DEED. So I think if we look at some of the policies that were passed this session and how government laden they were, we could take a look at how we could do things better and have less expansion of the bureaucracy in the state government. They grew state government by 40%. So we need to take a look at how that happened and maybe pull back some of those programs that haven't been implemented yet.
Is it fair to say that the focus on finding
Well, I don't know. I mean, clearly we're not in control of the budget right now, right? Because we've got Speaker Hortman and Leader Dietzich that are putting that together with their caucus. What we are doing is we're continually putting out alternatives to ways to streamline and make more efficient government services, to make sure that our tax policy is in line with the values of Minnesota. That's what we're doing constantly, day after day. Democrats didn't take any of our suggestions last year, and we see the result of that. We see the deficit coming up. We're going to continue to work hard to hold their feet to the fire as their bills come forward. And then hopefully next fall, we have a change where we can get a different voice in there to actually bring prudence back to our budget.
Well, you say that, but in July, after the session, the last couple, the
Yeah, so we can, this February forecast hadn't been presented at that point. We hadn't accounted fully, the bond houses hadn't fully accounted for all the language that had been implemented. So now that we actually see some of the effects of that, I haven't heard anything from bond houses or anything like that at this point, but there's going to be, they're going to take another look at this, I'm sure, and revalue where we are. But we're coming close to debt service and different things across the state. That's got to have an impact on our ability to borrow too.
You know, that news just came out. I think it's going to be very frustrating for Minnesotans. They were expecting a $2,000 rebate check, and they got $260, and now on top of it, they're going to have to pay federal taxes. Minnesotans are incredibly frustrated at how the $17.5 billion surplus was squandered, and this just adds insult to injury. So.
Did we see a preview of some campaign fodder about the caucuses and a press release?
You're up next, I guess. So.
I mean, I think there's a lot of things to run on. The Democrat deficit certainly is one of them. I would say the Palace for Politicians is another one. We're spending $730 million to renovate the state office building. It's unconscionable. There are so many examples of exorbitant spending, of not setting priorities, of not prioritizing Minnesota families who really are struggling. We don't need $730 million spent on the state office building when families are struggling to afford gas and groceries. So yes, we'll have, I think, plenty of things to discuss next fall.
Wasn't Hootie, but